Thanks for coming. When I was thinking about this presentation and how to help people present better, I really thought that you have to build a presentation much in the same way that you build a house. You start with a foundation, and you can't do anything else without that base. Once you have the foundation, you can build up the walls, then you can put on a roof. Finally, after you have this skeleton of the house, you can decorate and put a little bit more personality into it. And finally, you can occupy it, and that has a lot to do with the feeling of the house. So how does this relate to presentations? Well, the foundation of a presentation is always going to be the audience and maybe the venue. You really have to think about who are you talking to and what's the setting that you're talking in. Once you have a good understanding of your audience, then you can build your walls or the structure of your presentation. How are you going to tell the story of your work? From there, you can put on a roof. And in this analogy, I've decided that the roof is the content. And for you guys, the content is whatever you guys are going to be talking about. And I have no suggestions there at all. Whatever your content is, your content is. But then we can get into decorating with aesthetics and animations. And that's a subjective thing, but we'll talk about what you can do to help make something look like you've put some thought into it. And finally, the occupant, which is you. So the way that you present your presentation is going to be really important. So let's start with the foundation. What sort of audiences can you envision giving presentations to? Well, as a scientist, maybe an undergrad student or a graduate student or above graduate student somewhere in the science field, at some point, you'll probably give a presentation to other scientists in your field. And you may also give a presentation to scientists in other fields. So those are two separate groups, and that's important to realize. You might give a presentation during a job interview to a potential boss, and that's going to be a very different presentation than the other two. You might do an elevator pitch to a potential investor or something like that. You might do something more like a TED Talk where you're going to be addressing the general public or lay people. And you might give a presentation to students or other students. If you're a student right now, maybe you're going to give a presentation in a class. Whoever your audience is really is going to dictate where you go with your presentation. So much in the way that houses have different shaped foundations, audiences have different backgrounds. So scientists in your field will have one kind of footprint or background. Scientists in other fields will have a slightly different footprint or background. And lay people will have a completely different footprint or background. So it's really important to realize what is the footprint or background of these people and how can you present to make the best use of that space or of that information. So I wanted to have somebody else chime in about why it's important to know your audience and why communication is so important. So I'm going to let you guys listen to a very short portion of one of the podcasts that we recently released. The podcast is called Stories from the NNI, in case you're interested. And this was a podcast that we recorded with Stan Williams. He's right now a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Texas A&M, but he spent the last 23 years working for Hewlett-Packard as a senior fellow. And so he's worked in academia. Before that, he was actually a professor at UCLA for a long time. So he's worked in academia, he's worked in industry. He has a really good, broad knowledge of why communication might be important. So let's listen to what he's got to say.
And in fact, I actually get asked quite often by young people what it is that they should be studying specifically to get into nanotechnology. And what I tell them is study any field of science or technology that seems interesting to you, but make sure that you spend a lot of time learning how to communicate. Take writing classes, take speech classes, learn how to communicate with somebody who doesn't use your vocabulary. That's probably the most important thing that can happen. And in many ways, in my own career, it's why I wound up rising where I did within the Hewlett-Packard company. It wasn't that I was the smartest person around, but I could usually explain somebody else's work better than they could to the local boss. The whole communication issue is absolutely key because you're going to be talking to people who speak a different language. And many times that different language is going to be English, but it's going to be a completely strange set of terminology. And you have to be able to learn that on the fly. You have to be able to understand concepts and be willing to work with people. All too often, what happens with established researchers now is people from different fields get together and they start talking to each other, and they immediately decide that the other person is stupid or incompetent because they've used a word in a fashion that the listener understands is not the way it's been defined in their field. And I think that what people have to understand is that no one owns a word. We may own a concept, and there's different ways of describing the concept, but you have to get around this ownership of jargon process and get down to the level of understanding. Once you can do that, then the magic really starts happening.
So if you're talking to someone, you have to understand where they're coming from. Important to know your audience and what sort of language you can use and what sort of style you can use and everything that goes along with that. So once you have a foundation of your presentation by understanding your audience, you can build your walls. And that is really how you structure your presentation. So what kind of presentation does your audience want or expect? For something like a scientific audience, the structure of the presentations is pretty well laid out. You're going to have an introduction, an experimental section with methods, a results section where you talk about what you found, a discussion section, and finally conclusions and maybe future directions. But for something like a layperson audience, you want to use a different structure. For the most part, someone who's just a regular person off the street, they probably don't necessarily care about the very specific details of your experiment or your methods that you used. They want to hear why you're doing your research and what you've found. So you should tell them a story. Start with the characters. The character is probably you. Why do you have a connection to whatever you're telling them? Why do you have a connection to your research? Why do you have a connection to the company that you're going to propose? Why do you have a connection to this topic? Tell them about the context. What's the background? What is the setting for this story? Is there a problem that needs to be solved? Is there a conflict? What is that problem and where does it fit in the context of society? Then you have a resolution, which is your research or your work. How is your research going to address this problem, or what have you found in your research to address this problem? And finally, I call this the happily ever after, where you talk about what is the next step. The princess and the prince have gotten married and they lived happily ever after. You can say, well, I've done this research, this is what I've found, and this is what happens next. For a scientific audience, you kind of want to stick with a very structured presentation. If you want to play with that structure, you should feel free. You should understand what your audience is expecting to get before you break those rules. And if you're talking to a layperson audience, if you're doing a TED Talk, you want to tell a story. You really want to personalize it. From there, we move on to the roof. Just like the foundation and the walls are holding up your roof, the structure, the whole presentation that you're doing is holding up your content. What is your research? What's the company you're proposing? What's whatever else you might be presenting on? Whatever you've got there, that's what you talk about. Finally, or I guess next to last, we move on to the decor. So this is the exciting part, for me at least. Once you have a house built, you can fill it with things. And hopefully these things will make the house look better. That's always the goal, make something look better, not worse. What I want to emphasize here is that there are different styles, just like these two rooms in a house have been decorated very differently. Presentations are also going to have very different styles. And I'm not going to say that one style is better than another. I just want you to be aware of what your style is and try to improve that style to reflect you as best as possible. So whatever style you end up going with, it should reflect you, but not be distracting. The main point here is that you should put some thought into these aesthetics. Because if you can keep somebody's interest by making a nicer looking PowerPoint or making a nicer looking poster, then that can only be a good thing. One thing that I want to note here is that both of these styles, although very different, have very graphic looks. They all have pictures on the walls, they all have textural aspects, and your presentation should sort of go the same direction. So that brings us to a big question in presentations. How much text do I use? And my thought here is that you should only use just enough text to get your point across, just enough to tell your story. So here's an example of a very text-heavy slide. And it says, you can use bullets to tell your story. They are less intimidating than solid blocks of text. In addition, you don't have to use complete sentences. Finally, try to figure out ways to use figures in place of words whenever possible. That block of text is really intimidating. So anytime you see something like this, try to think of, how can I make this a little bit better? How can I communicate this information a little more efficiently or effectively? So I designed another slide, which is still not an exciting slide, but it conveys the information with a lot less text. I've used bullets. I have made a figure where it basically illustrates that the probability of a listener, or maybe this is for a poster, the probability of someone continuing to read your poster drops dramatically as the number of words increases. And I completely made up this slide. This is not actual data or anything. But there's always a way to find a way to tell your story in a graphic way. So what sort of figures can you use for a research presentation? Obvious are going to be diagrams of your experimental setup. So here's a diagram that I used in grad school. Pictures of relevant aspects of the experiment. Maybe instead of doing a diagram of your experimental setup, maybe you'll do a picture of your experimental setup. But think of creative ways to convey your information. And finally, plots of analyzed data showing trends that you found. And these are all pretty straightforward parts of doing a research presentation. But if you can take these ideas and apply them to other types of slides that maybe would have just been bullets to begin with, you can figure out ways to make them more graphic. So it all just takes a little bit of thought and creativity. So if you're doing a poster, I wanted to kind of talk about how you can upgrade a poster. These are two posters that I've done in various points of my career. The first one was during my master's. And as you can see, this poster on the left, it has way too much text. And second of all, these blocks of text look kind of messy. So if you were going to do a block of text, you could justify it so it looks a little neater. I did use some diagrams here, but they're pretty basic. I think I could have done a little bit better there. But the main thing is the blocks of text. I should have found better ways to make bullets. I should have found better ways to make these into graphics. And the colors are not the most exciting. Or maybe they're a little too exciting. I don't know. This is a poster that I made towards the end of my PhD. And here you can see I've made a much bigger effort to reduce the amount of text. The intro is short, and I've used some pretty pictures to kind of illustrate what my project is about. Anywhere that I could put a diagram, I put a diagram. Anywhere that made sense to have a photo, I used a photo. Basically, I tried to just make this as graphic as possible so it would catch a viewer's eye from across the room. And I'm pretty happy with this. I think I still look back at posters and think, oh, I could have done this better. I could have done that better. But when I look back at my very old posters, I can definitely see that just trying to do a little bit better at each poster has really made a big difference. So I think if you have that growth mindset, you can really go far. Oh, so I have a question here. Can the plots be overwhelming if the audience is lay people? Yes, definitely. This first portion of the presentation will be specifically for a scientific audience, and probably a scientific audience of people that are in your field. So in just a minute, I'll talk about graphics for a lay people audience. So yeah, a lot of these figures I would not use if I was talking to a general audience. But for someone who is coming in with a scientific background, they're going to expect to see these sorts of plots. They want to see the nitty-gritty details of your experimental and your results. So sometimes you got to give the people what they want. But yes, I will get to the lay people in just a couple slides. Then I want to talk about, we just talked about posters. Now, if you're doing an oral PowerPoint presentation, you can always look for ways to upgrade your slides. So for example, when I first made my About Me slide, I put a picture on there of me and I put in some bullets. But I looked at it and I thought well, it looks a little boring. I wonder if there's a way for me to upgrade this slide. And I realized this was kind of a history of me. One thing flowed into the next. So I decided to make kind of a more flowchart look. I started with an MS, I went to a PhD, my next job was a Congressional Science Fellow, and now I'm here at NNCO. And it conveys the same amount of information, but it's a little bit more interesting to the eye. So that is kind of how I thought about things. So you can do that a lot with a lot of slides. So even when you don't know initially what to do to make something more graphic or more interesting, come back to it. This is what I made first. I came back to it with another thought and decided to just try something different. So now we get to, if you're talking to a layperson audience, how much text do you use for a layperson audience? And my answer to that is as little as possible. So this is a picture of me from when I was competing at the UC-wide grad slam competition, where I had 3 minutes and 3 slides to talk about my research. And this slide that's next to me, I was talking about how understanding aerosols was a big missing puzzle piece in the puzzle of climate change, or understanding climate change. And so I came up with this slide where it shows that aerosols are a little missing puzzle piece so that people would be engaged. It uses very little text. And while the audience is looking at this slide, I'm going to be explaining it so hopefully it makes sense to them. The types of graphics that you should use for a layperson audience is going to be most often pictures. People love to see pretty pictures. It's just really impactful to see beautiful pictures. You can always make flow charts or maybe animation, cartoon looking graphics. So I'm not saying only pictures, but everything should be graphical. And probably you want to steer clear of things like plots of data or charts in general. That brings us to color. And this is going to be kind of a subjective thing. Everybody's going to like different colors, but you can try to do your best based on your style to make your presentation stand out. Pick a color scheme that's interesting, but doesn't distract. So what do I mean by distracting and interesting colors? So if you use really bright colors in large areas, that's probably going to be distracting. You can still use bright colors and exciting colors, but try to use them as accent colors and use a more neutral color as the main color. So here on the left, we have bright colors that really don't go together. That would be kind of hard on the viewer's eyes. So you want to stay away from that. You want to pick colors that go together and in proportions that make sense. So here I've kind of illustrated that you should use more, in this case, more dark blue, a little bit of pink, and a little bit of this teal color. And this is just colors that I like. You might not like those colors, so you could find your own color combinations that work well. So if you need help picking colors that go together, you can do a Google image search for 3 color combinations, and it will come up with a whole bunch of colors that designers have said go together. I'm not a designer, so I do this Google search a lot when I'm making presentations. And sometimes it takes me a few times to pick out what the color I actually want to use is. Another aspect of making your poster stand out is you need to make sure that people are able to read what's on your slide or your poster. So, for example, this kind of marbly texture is really difficult to read no matter what color text is in front of it. On top of the green, I can read both texts, but it kind of hurts your eyes when you have to focus on it for too long. So I would avoid the bright green background. The navy blue, I can't really read the black writing, but I can read the white writing really well. So just whatever colors you end up using as a background and whatever colors you have picked for your text should go together so that you can read things clearly. And this brings us to one of my favorite topics, animations. So this might be contentious because there's a lot of thoughts on if you should animate or if you should not animate. There's a few different options for animations. The first is to use none. As you can see, that's not my option ever. But this is the safest option. So if you're not confident in knowing when animations look tacky, you can stick with no animations. Once you get past that, you can do subtle animations. These include things like fade, grow, shrink, transparency, font color. All those subtle effects can be used to basically direct the viewer's eyes. And finally, you can kind of combine all of these possible animations to make really complex animations, but you really need to do it tactfully. And it takes a lot of effort to do these sorts of animations, but if you can pull them off, I think they're pretty cool. And other people might have different opinions on that. So you've got to figure out what your style is and go with that. So just talk a little bit about these subtle animations. I like to use subtle animations to direct the viewer's attention to wherever you want it to be at a specific time in your presentation. So you can use the technique of bullets entering one at a time. You can change the transparency of text or graphics. So like here you can see one bullet has been made more transparent and the other one is not. So it's clear that you're talking about this bullet on the bottom. You can change the size of text or graphics. That way, when something gets bigger, people know to pay attention to it. And finally, you can use arrows or circles to direct attention to things on graphs or particular words in a text box and any other thing that you want to direct attention to. For complex animations, I generally use these to explain complex processes like experimental procedures, biological processes, chemical reactions, and environmental cycles. Anytime you have something that you want to explain graphically, but it's really complex, you can figure out a way to do this with animations. It takes a lot of time to learn how to do it, and it takes a lot of effort, but I really enjoy it. So here's one of the animations that I've made for a presentation in the past. And this was an experimental procedure. And in this procedure, we would add water vapor and ozone into a glass container, turn on ultraviolet lights, where it then reacts to make hydroxyl radical. We add in a volatile organic compound, producing aerosol particles in this glass bottle. And finally, we turn on a vacuum pump to suck these particles, and they're impacted onto a filter at this little box right here. So with this, I'm able to explain how my experiment works without using step-by-step bullets or something like that. So I really enjoy making these animations. So this is like a personal preference, but everybody can do whatever they want. And I just want to point out that you can do more with PowerPoint than you think. A lot of people think of PowerPoint as images flying across the screen and blinking lights and things like that. So I wanted to show you an animation that I made for just a little animated video. And this was all done in PowerPoint. This was to talk about how geckos use nanotechnology or nanostructures to walk on walls. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with PowerPoint. So keep an open mind and always try new things. If you can try something and if it doesn't work, you don't have to use it. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is the occupant of our hypothetical house. And that is you. You're the one that's presenting this work. And you're doing exciting work. And this is, in some cases, this is going to be your life work. And you should be excited about it. Let it show. You should make an effort to sound excited. I know sometimes that's difficult, especially when you're talking about science. You have this expectation of wanting to present the facts and only the facts. And that doesn't necessarily lend itself to sounding excited. But, so if you have a difficulty sounding excited naturally, here's a couple tips on how you can make yourself sound excited. You can vary the pitch of your voice, so rise and falls are good. You can use dramatic pauses when appropriate. I mean, you don't want to be letting your audience hang for too long, but when you have something that you're going to say that's going to be really important, pause to make sure everybody's looking at you. Because if you're talking and all of a sudden you stop, people are going to be like, oh, what happened? What changed? Then they'll definitely be paying attention to you. And then when you say your next line, it'll make a bigger impact. And you can vary the pacing of your speech. So some things you can get through by talking pretty quickly, but on really complex topics or experiment procedures or things like that, try to slow down so that people are able to understand. And then the most important thing about this is to practice doing these. Sometimes it doesn't come naturally, and you have to listen to yourself and how you are talking, and then try to make adjustments the next time you say something. Like, for example, and I've done it here, I know, the kind of upspeak where you kind of phrase everything as a question kind of lends itself to making you seem like you don't know what you're talking about. And I used to do that all the time, but I tried really hard to work on keeping my pitch lower at the end of each sentence. And it still slips in every once in a while, but you just try to, like I said, this is growth mindset. You always try to do a little bit better than the last time you did something. And that's how I've always approached presentations. And with that, do we have any questions? Hopefully I covered some things that you guys were interested in. So if any of you guys have questions, feel free to just submit them in the little submit your questions here block. So we have a question that says, how do you know when too much text is too much in presentations and posters? And I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. I mean, sometimes if you're explaining something and you really want the audience to take away a certain aspect, I will write out the full sentence. If you can get away with using none, then use none. If you need some text on the slides to help you remember what you're going to say, keep the text on the slides. Try to keep just as much as you need so that you can get by. And then, like I said, if you have an important conclusion from your work, write it out. Make it its own slide. Make it important and show that off. I think with each slide, ask yourself, can I do this slide with less text? And if the answer is yes, might as well try it. We have a question from Lisa. What do you do if your animations don't work during the presentation? And that's a really scary one. So for example, my video didn't work today. So my thoughts are, you should know, if you have animations, you should know where they're supposed to be well enough and what you're going to be saying well enough that you can explain what the animation, what's happening. If you can present that slide as if there was nothing there, you just got to do your best. So hopefully most of the content is on the slides. Sometimes, I mean, the worst case scenario would be is if there's a graph that you need to talk about and it doesn't pop up. If that's the case, then you've got to try to explain what's happening in this figure verbally. So you could say, like, in this figure that should be on the slide, we have concentration over time. And as you can see, as you can't see, I guess, as you increase, you have an inflection point right here at whatever number it would be. So I think the important thing is to know your content really well so that if there is an issue, you can explain it on your own. You don't need to rely on the visual aids. So from Amin, we have, what are words that grab the attention or intonations that are recommended to keep people listening? I mean, I think this is going to be a personal style thing. I mean, at least the intonation aspect is going to be a personal style. Everybody's accent is a little bit different, and you're going to have different natural intonations. I think the important thing is to try to be true to yourself, but maybe bigger. Try to make things slightly exaggerated. I think that helps me, because when I talk, I mean, maybe you can hear it now, but I tend to talk pretty quickly. So when I am presenting, I try to slow down, and then I try to make my enunciation a little bit better, and I try to make my vocal variety a little bit bigger, things like that. And for words that grab the attention, I think that depends on who your audience is. I mean, something that's going to grab a scientist's attention is going to be very different than the lay person. I don't think I have any tips for words, but I will, if I think of anything, I mean, I can email you. So from Marina, do you have any tips for memorizing long presentations? Yeah, I think my so I generally really like to have presentations memorized or very close to memorized, because I feel like I'm much better at presenting when I really know what I'm going to say. Other people are much better at going off the cuff. But if you know you like memorizing, I wouldn't suggest trying to memorize everything in a long presentation. Instead, I would make sure you have like hot button items that you know you need to talk about, memorize those, and then practice your presentation a bunch. I practice probably more than I should. Not for this presentation, but for like my defense presentation. So my tip is practice and don't try to memorize. If you have an hour-long presentation, like for defense, it's really hard to memorize every single word in that presentation. But you can memorize the ideas, and maybe that you have certain phrases that you know you need to say, and I would suggest memorizing those. If you have a conclusion that you know you want to phrase a specific way, memorize that. But beyond that, try to memorize ideas rather than words. From Hundo, when is it appropriate to use humor in your presentation? Always? I mean, it depends probably on your humor. You definitely try to make it appropriate humor, but I wouldn't necessarily, like, you got to be yourself. And if you feel like, oh, this is something funny, you might as well say it. You don't have to like hold it back. You just got to be yourself. I also wouldn't try to force the humor. Like, there's no reason to be planning jokes into your conference presentations. But if something happened, I mean, you can actually plan something, but try to make things natural as possible. But I mean, this comes back to knowing who your audience is. How are they going to react to humor? I think most people enjoy humor, so I think it's mostly appropriate to use humor. But give a good thought about who's going to be in the audience. Will somebody think it's weird that I have a joke in here? And then go from there. And then we have Ayankas. Hopefully I said that right. How do you approach questions raised during a presentation if they are raised in the middle of the presentation, especially? That's probably one of the hardest issues I have, especially if you really like memorizing things. It can kind of disrupt how you're talking, the flow that you've got going. You've kind of just got to answer the question. I mean, presumably you know how to answer the question, so answer the question the best you can. And then if you can't remember where you left off, go back, start at the beginning of the slide again and go from there. Basically, start from wherever you are comfortable starting from and go. People aren't going to mind if you repeat yourself for an extra 30 seconds. So I think that's kind of how I would approach being interrupted like that. All right. Any other questions? Well, I just want to thank you guys all for coming to the webinar. It really means a lot. I hope that you guys got some good tips out of this. Again, this is all kind of my style of presenting. And I think once you start doing presentations and trying to develop a style, you're going to have your own ideas of what makes a good presentation. Maybe some of my thoughts aren't what you want to go with, but maybe some of them are. I just hope that I've inspired you to really think about each aspect of your presentation, especially how you build it, going from your audience to your structure, to your decor, and things like that. I have another question about humor. As an addition to the humor question, how should we set the mood for the presentation if the crowd is very professional? So you mean like, how do you start your presentation when you go up for, say, a conference presentation or for like a defense presentation? I think it depends on the room. That's kind of a cop-out answer, I know. But, and again, it comes back to who your audience is. For my defense, I felt pretty comfortable with almost everybody in the room. So it wasn't that hard to just get started and be myself. When you have something like a conference where maybe you don't know anybody in the room, then I would start off by being more professional. Maybe introduce yourself, where you're from. You do a little, like, the short little bio that you're about yourself, and then move on from there. And then there's never a problem with starting more professional. And then if a joke comes in, I think that's fine. But yeah, I think if the crowd is very professional, you should kind of go with what their expectations are and present how they expect. But once you get going and you're kind of more comfortable, then I feel like it's easy for your personality to come out a little bit better, unless you're really nervous. But then you kind of just got to do your best. Kind of got to fake your presentation, or fake your personality and fake it till you make it, I guess. That was a tough question, though. So hopefully all of this was really helpful. And with that, I guess we will close out. Thank you guys all so much for coming.